Yeah. Second room.
Everyone, please settle down. Can I have every VIT person sitting down in this room?
My head is.
Are the streams on, by the way?
Osho will be taller than me, so.
इसके साथ record. So Rad is sitting here.
Wait, you need to give the Shantanu. He's the chair. No, sir, you sit here. Time keep करना है. अभी ना. वो शांतनु shift one seat. Next to यहाँ पे next to शांतनु से करना.
Already on. It's working.
You sit next to Shantanu.
Okay, guys. Lost and found announcement. Anyone who's an owner of a
Guys, please settle down. We're starting now. Welcome to the finals of VITDT 2018. On OG we have here for Bharath from SLCU. On OO we have King Crimson from RB. On CG we have last debate ever from NLS and Nalsa. And on CO we have NLSX. On the motion, this house supports the setting up of alternate international institutions like AIDB by China. We are on the panel. We have Saharsh, Suchi, and myself, Shantanu, as chair. I now invite the Prime Minister to open case on side opening government here.
You guys want a mic?
The mic is handed. That's the issue.
Yeah. Someone can.
I don't think I can now.
No, you can.
Okay, am I audible? No. Yeah.
Okay, everyone, please keep the clapping and all to start for us.
Is it okay if I? No, it's nice.
Hello. Okay. Am I audible now?
Yeah.
Alright. So international institutions are any forms of institutions where a group of countries come together and they agree to negotiate, to have certain ways in which they are going to negotiate with other countries for the kind of policies that they want, and they are going to agree to certain forms of ways in which they are going to go ahead and form their further policies, right? What we propose here from our side is that instead of these organizations that exist currently in terms of United Nations and larger groups of countries, we are going to have alternative institutions and provide alternatives to smaller countries to come together and form groups wherein they can have the similar forms of negotiations on smaller forms, and they can have an alternative to these kinds of deals and a form of opt-out to these forms of deals. These smaller groups of countries will obviously have certain forms of aligned interests in the way in which they function, right? First of all, the idea of China going ahead and creating these forms of institutions. The reason we believe that it's okay for you to go ahead and do that is because there's a disproportionality in the way in which you go ahead and form certain deals, which I'm going to explain later. However, when certain countries lose out in the way in which they can negotiate or the ability to negotiate, we think at that point we create these institutions. We think the reason that China will has the ability to create change in terms of the kind of countries that exist around it in terms of geographical proximity are extremely poor, and at the point at which China has the ability to form these blocks with them and create a international forums wherein they can discuss their issues, they're going to get a greater benefit out of it. We think the reason that now the level of your negotiations is going to become slightly fairer, and China will act rationally in the way in which these institutions are constructed is because of the fact that an alternative exists. At the point at which these countries believe that China is possibly strongmanning them or creating a position for itself like USA does in the United Nations, they always have that opt-out of going ahead and being I'm going to go back to the United Nations and the kind of obligations it abided me by because it's fairer for me. So China will necessarily have to create the kind of deals for it, it's in terms of the way it negotiates, wherein it's fair for all countries, and otherwise these countries will always have that opt-out. We think why necessarily the way in which these organizations we believe will be created will be slightly fairer. We think bilateral negotiations by its merit are specifically for developing countries a little more fairer, because that's what China has always believed in terms of rather than multilateral negotiations. We think the reason that they are a little more fairer is because you can go ahead and directly represent your needs and get what you want. For example, a lot of provisions of GAAP, GATT and all of that restrict India from imposing sanctions or higher tariffs on Pakistani goods, even though negotiations for terrorism, counter-terrorism attacks might help them in doing so. We think it's a little unfair. We think India and Pakistan should be allowed to at that point negotiate freely, and that bilateral negotiation will be slightly better off. We think these bilateral negotiations become slightly more likely at the point at which a body like China, which has always believed in bilateral negotiations and rejected multilateral negotiations, will create these forms of negotiations. We think how specifically smaller countries lose out when organizations like WTO function with certain Western ideals of how the world economy is supposed to function, right? The way in which they lose out is because they are based on Western ideals of fairness and how an economy is supposed to run. We think the kind of impositions that WTO would have on India in terms of you can't subsidize people even though your industries are dying and they cannot compete necessarily with foreign organizations and MNCs and things like that. At that point, we think it's fair for you to go ahead and it's unfair for you to go ahead and tell them that they can't protect their own industry, even though the kind of revenues that will be created through international trade will necessarily go to USA. We think at that point, we don't reject free trade. However, certain form of protection to their own industries is something that India should be allowed to do. We think that becomes a little unfair. So the bargaining power of these smaller countries in, for example, these organizations extremely less. We believe it's going to be a little more at the point at which the entire purpose of creating these organizations is to give power to a certain form of organizations who have aligned interests, as well as there is always that idea of an opt-out wherein you can China will have to go ahead and accommodate these needs, otherwise they can simply opt out. Closing.
As a small nation negotiating bilaterally with China, I have very limited bargaining power. My bargaining power is much greater when I can coalesce with other small nations in one singular international institution. How does your case on bargaining power?
So basically, the reason we believe that these smaller countries will have a better bargaining power is because of the fact that China cannot strongman these countries, and it's not going to do that at the point at which it is aware that the only institution or the institution it has constructed is going to work if these countries decide to stay in that institution. We think at the point at which they are so unfair to these organizations that these countries can simply opt out, we think that is not what China is going to do. It is going to act rationally to the extent that it serves its own purposes at least, which is why it will be able to create that form of change. And why we think like smaller countries are not able to like form the kind of collectivization on like international forums that they are talking about, because at some point, even if you have certain legitimate concerns and you're a group of countries, for example, geographically proximate to each other who have like legitimate aligned concerns, these concerns become washed out or like get washed out by the majority of concerns that other nations might have, or the majority of interests or political interests that USA might have, the kind of strong manning that can happen there, which means that kind of negotiating power really does not exist there. India, like countries in like India have not been able to negotiate for like leeway for having some forms of protection. That hasn't happened, which means that at the point at which you are the only reason you're creating this organization is for the interest to exist, you are going to create that fairer opt-in. We think like at the point at which like you have like a smaller like group of more specific needs that you need to address, you can also function better in terms of your like allocation of resources, in terms of your policy formulation, and the kind of things you decide to direct your political capital in. We think at the point at which these things are extremely generalized to the extent you no longer understand, like you no longer accommodate for all kinds of needs that different countries can have, you leave out that cost away. We think these countries will definitely have a greater voice in these nations to like voice their opinions and have like better trade deals for themselves which are aligned by their interests, and like create a better competition for themselves and make it slightly fairer for themselves. Okay.
Thank the speaker for the speech and invite the leader of opposition to
Am I audible? So opening government tells you that it becomes difficult for these countries to necessarily negotiate with the IMF. They've been at the receiving end of raw deals from IMF again and again. But they don't necessarily tell us how that negotiation will suddenly start happening when now the other acting party is now China, right? That doesn't necessarily have the same kinds of interest, that has policies that are like that have extremely staunch policies in terms of what they necessarily follow, which is not as like open as the IMF in terms of like representation, and is simply controlled by one country and its own interests, right? To like maybe move ahead in this debate, we need to see how those kind of negotiations will necessarily pan out as compared to the existing negotiations. But more importantly, right, like how do these negotiations even work, right? The fact that like this is located in Asia in terms of the smaller countries, you necessarily see that they have lesser political power, they're smaller countries, they're economically backward, and can't necessarily go ahead and compete with, like can necessarily negotiate with China in the first place, right? The fact that they can necessarily like say that, look, these are our strict conditions before which we will necessarily agree for any form of a deal is not something that they're in a position for, right? But more importantly, right, the whole idea that they get wrong is that once like you necessarily take, like if you take this loan and you don't like the deal, you can obviously go to the IMF, right? Like there are two problems with this, right? The fact that when you agree to a loan and that's like a long-term funding, which is not like a one-time installment, you have to continue to give in to the kinds of demands and support China at any form of representation that they're necessarily doing, right? Which necessarily means that's not a one-time deal that you meet three conditions immediately and you get the check for that amount of money. It's something that's paid in installments, something that you have to ensure you necessarily conform to over and over again. They can't necessarily run away with the alternative. But more importantly, right, understand like how this like whole like these kind of institutions even came up in the first place, right? The fact that why China as an alternate body to provide these kind of loans is even succeeding or even can compete with the IMF at that kind of a scale is simply because of the kind of conditions that they necessarily give, right? The fact that like they won't like the scale at which they can necessarily provide loans, the kind of like lesser collateral, like more easier conditions to follow is the whole reason why people went ahead in the first place, right? Because understand this, right? Like the way or the kind of conditions that IMF necessarily imposes is of in terms of like economic return to a large extent, right? Your ability to pay back that loan, like the way you've taken it, right? China as an institution often succeeds in giving these kind of loans as an alternative because it doesn't necessarily seek the same kind of economic conditions, but instead looks for other kinds of strategic conditions that are beneficial for them, which is why it becomes particularly problematic for them, for anybody that's taken loans from them to necessarily opt out, right? From my speech, I'll be talking to you about firstly why, like, if China is the one that necessarily controls this entire organization, it becomes extremely difficult for someone from outside to go ahead and correct it or push for any kind of idea, right? The fact that even if they argue in their best case that look like the IMF, etc., might has a hegemon like the United States of America that has been like unfair in giving these kind of deals, they have to run the comparative, right? Now that China is a hegemon, do you necessarily think that the deals will be of better quality or deals will be more favorable, right? The fact that USA can to a large extent still be negotiated and can still, like there is still some form of diplomacy that exists in contrast to China that necessarily overrules and overrides a lot of international decisions simply by saying that, look, we don't recognize like the jurisdiction of various kinds of courts, is the comparative that they necessarily have to argue, right? But more importantly, right, what will this necessarily look like the minute any form of installment or any form of agreement has been come about, right? The fact that this is how economic imperialism in like Southeast Asia will necessarily start, right, with China as the head. So what do I mean by this, right? The fact that given that they're an alternative, a lucrative alternative in terms of getting high loans from the IMF without necessarily having the same kind of economic policies to necessarily conform to, it comes at the cost of necessarily like China invading your autonomy and having a greater control in your kinds of policies, right? What do I mean by this, right? The fact that they will necessarily be extremely picky about not only the amount of fund later that they're necessarily giving, but what kind of projects those like that kind of fund is necessarily being even used for, right? And this necessarily results into a form of economic control wherein you necessarily go in and actually start looking at the kind of policies that they're implementing, right? And given that these countries already have less political power, it simply becomes even more difficult for like these countries to necessarily opt out in terms of in terms of the political control, right? Like because this funding always comes at the cost of personal autonomy, right? And what necessarily then happens is that like these kind of small countries are now coerced or forced to necessarily conform to China, especially in international forums, right? The fact that like in the case of Philippines where we saw that they were necessarily able to their funding of like vigilante justice and the drug war necessarily meant that Philippines could like easily like not care about like USA's tactics to like maybe bring about some form of like a proper attack on the war of drugs by simply saying that, look, if you don't fund us, we are not going to change our ways. We'll simply go to somebody else who supports us, right? And that becomes particularly problematic, right? Because the kind of negotiating power you use with these kind of countries is in stark contrast to the kind of things that Western liberal democracies look for in coming into any kind of deal closing.
Do you think the growth of China as a political power is something which is reversible or irreversible?
So, as of now, if you look at China's situation, is another reason why they're necessarily able to get that kind of power in the first place, right? The fact that everybody views them as a center of economic development in Asia at least shows that in the foreseeable future, it's like they'll be the ones who will necessarily be able to attract like the kinds of investments, right? Which is why it becomes even more difficult for you to necessarily opt out of these kind of institutions simply because like the minute you opt out of China or say no to China's conditions, not only does China stop supporting you, but anyone else that is being funded through China, through that bank, is someone that you upset, right? Someone that will not necessarily go ahead with you because they act together, right? But lastly, right, the whole idea of like why this is like necessarily a bad idea in terms of like China necessarily being at the receiving end of this, China necessarily being the actor in this kind of position, right? The fact that you have to consider like how they even came about in the first place, right? The fact that those trade-offs that they made in terms of like seeking the right kind of economic conditions and economic benefits is something that they like willingly gave up, which is why like someone like IMF couldn't even compete in the first place, right? So saying that IMF is an alternative once I get like pissed off at say China's conditions is not a feasible like option for me in the first place, because not only have I already given in to China's demands, not only do I like stop receiving installments of payments, but I also stop receiving any form of support from any of the other investors that China might have necessarily gotten for this kind of body, right? understand that the kind of conditions and the ends or the like that China's like institution is trying to use is very different from like the idea behind why the IMF or the World Bank was necessarily set up, right? They necessarily just try to bring about basic development in terms of like necessarily funding it and look for some kind of returns. Like these people here are strictly choosing the kind of projects that they necessarily need to fund, right? For government to necessarily argue the comparative, they have to tell us why China as a hegemon is in a much better position to argue these kind of ideas. They have to tell us why economic imperialism will not necessarily happen, given that now you're arguing with an actor like China and you have lesser control. Why giving up your autonomy is worth the money that you're going to get. Very, very proud.
Can I get a minute count for this timing? What's timing? Minute count. 1, 2, 3. Do I have to use a mic or? No, it's my choice. So what we heard from opposition today is that what we need to do in order to win this debate is to show you specifically contextually why China is in a position to like give you more optimal returns, and why like if we through comparative analysis tell you why the IMF isn't able to give you the kind of deals that China can give you, we tell you why an alternative international institution, something that China could come up with, would necessarily be like a better way in order for the international community to progress, right? So let's start with China, and I'm going to structure this argument into 2 different ways. Firstly, to understand China the way they see fit, which is essentially this irrational player that essentially dominates the world market to the extent where they do it to like the deprivation of every other country over here right now. And let's understand the kind of deals that can happen within this system where China through this kind of decision calculus can do what, right? So with regard to doing something like this, let's understand that if you are a rational player involving yourself either in a bilateral negotiation or in a multilateral trading system, whichever it may be, you will have certain short-term obligations that you need to take into account of and certain long-term obligations that you need to take into account of. So this idea that they say that the moment you give me a loan and that like upon your like first like inability to pay that payment, we'll automatically reclaim everything and we'll start seizing assets and we'll completely destroy you and present you like the most possibly the worst case scenario that you can provide with regard to China strong arming and destroying like state structures in other countries that have unfortunately because of their gullibility signed up to these kind of a deal simply doesn't work. For the same reason why China doesn't necessarily like reclaim the debt that US owes to it, right? Because it recognizes that like if for instance you have like a specific like a deal with a particular country and you've like loaned out say a particular amount of resources, you need the money back, and it makes sense because ideally like the way in which you can prosper, right, only happens at the point at which both countries can like collectively become better, right? Like if you're a country that necessarily owes certain obligations in the form of like financial commitments to China, China's ability to procure these these obligations and payments only like is strengthened at the point at which the country is able to repay them as well. So the point at which Chinese action destroys these state structures and their inability to make these payments and completely destabilizes their economy doesn't make sense. I mean, if you think about it logically, and like the ability for Chinese like economy to produce goods and services into another country's market, like it kind of destroys that whole idea, right? Like your ability, like forget like countries as a whole, even as a profit maximizing firm, your ability to produce goods and services is contingent on aggregate consumer spending. So the better an economy is and the better a world economy is and the better your trading partners are, the better your ability to make these kind of things as well. So in the long run, which if you're China and a rational China, you will decide to like value these kind of like long-term like prosperous benefits that can come from something like this, right? China is not going to irrationally act like a short-term like ludicrous fool. We don't agree with that kind of characterization of China to begin with. 5th minute. All right, they tell you that we have to clash with the comparative, right? So they talk about the IMF and they make it seem like the IMF is a rosy organization that just gives you sweet deals to every single African country and poor developing and least developed nation in the world, and everyone is like happy and like they're working out, right? Unfortunately, the status quo isn't that. The IMF has so many different like conditions on every single payment that it has. In fact, it has a very, very rigid, like stringent structure in the way in which it can reclaim payments. In fact, even the way in which you can process your payments as a whole. So if you're asking specifically for a loan to like implement like clear like state structures like building dams and stuff, they tell you how to do it, what to do. They make it seem like China is going to invade your bodily autonomy, but for some reason the IMF isn't going to do. By investing in the financial superiority that an international organization like the IMF has, it can in fact create devastating effects, right? They make this comparative with us and say China will not do something like this. Then why is Sino SINOPEC so effective in African countries? If these African countries themselves were like, and all these least developed nations over here are getting wonderful deals from like organizations like the IMF, then why do they even ask for China to begin with? China is not going to destroy all the countries in the world, because the moment it destroys all the countries in the world, it's not going to have countries to even deal with in the first place, right? So this kind of short-term decision calculus where you start to hyperbolically discount standards to the point at which you want to destroy yourself simply doesn't work, right? So let's start with a rational China. And this is the point at which this contextualization becomes really important, right? Take a look at organizations like the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea. Understandably, they're significantly distinct from the IMF, but there's a specific reason why I'm pointing things out like this to you. It's funny that they brought up Philippines, because Philippines got a sweet deal from China that they could have never got in an organization like the ITLOS, and they talk about reservations that Chinese governments have, right, in these kind of international systems, like the fact that they reserve like the process of being tried in arbitration clauses and stuff like that. That is status quo. Let's consider that all they're saying is good and China is significantly bad. If China is significantly bad, let's not look at this thing in a vacuum and say, is SINOPEC bad? Yeah, SINOPEC can improve. China is essentially still going to be a profit maximizing player. If you want countries to start behaving altruistically and start helping everybody, I'm sorry, that kind of delusional utopia doesn't work, right? So what we need to understand then is the moment Philippines realize that these other international institutions like the ITLOS are failing because China's going to just be really happy and continue all the way until the point at which the verdict is rendered and they'll finally just give up. Like they realize that these institutions aren't working, right, under status quo, which is why Philippines, Duterte decided to communicate the Chinese government, because at the end of the day, they realize that this whole notion of sovereignty and bodily autonomy is only as important as symbolic principles are. At the end of the day, they wanted resources that they can distribute with regard to the Senkaku and Diaoyu Islands and the South China Sea. So they became regional partners. And this becomes like my other crucial construct that we need to understand, right? When you start to contrast the ability to get deals through like bilateral negotiations, you will not necessarily have like problems of like this arbitrary system of discrimination that happens in other kinds of organizations, because discrimination can happen in two ways. I can either treat one person and another person completely differently, even though they're exactly the same people, and that's as bad as so the application of a uniform standard and principle, which makes every country subject to the same kind of obligations, regardless of whether it can pay them or not do anything, is as significantly important as like the possibility and like the potentiality of saying I will treat one person better off and one person worse off. And that's precisely what happens to a lot of least developed countries in the world and a lot of developing countries in the world, which is why if you look at like multilateral trading systems like the WTO, even countries like India, which aren't the least developed country, have significantly so many problems, right, with regard to like cases that they fight in the WTO for agricultural subsidies all the time, right? That's precisely why the contextualization that came from my first speaker with regard to failing international institutions becomes significantly useful. Before I do that, closing.
So let's say I enter an institutional arrangement with Rational China and they start building a dam on my land. Now Rational China and they start influencing me to my harm. How easy is it for me to leave for this?
Right. So if they think that the possibility of giving you financial payments upon a deal that you can structure with regard to like fiscal payments that you can give them back extends to the point at which the Chinese government and like by extension all the organs and like of the Chinese government, I'm assuming like whatever it is, that they can start extending like and infringing upon the sovereignty and like the territorial integrity of a nation to the point at which they can influence government decisions exist, we simply don't buy that kind of argumentation, right? The point at which like the country's territorial sovereignty and their integrity is challenged, there are other alternative state structures where you can go and question this, right? The United Nations isn't going to stand around and watch while like the Chinese government first builds a bank or like first helps you build a dam and then automatically start saying, okay, this part of it is China's or whatever, or this is what you have to start doing with your policy. The point at which like the deal becomes fundamentally inefficacious to a country like China, you can still take them to an international organization and do what you want to. Chances are, like, yeah, okay, fair enough to say that, like, if these international institutions don't work, what are you going to do, right? Which is why I precisely tell you that you don't analyze these kind of things in a vacuum. You look at the kind of deals that countries can get with China, and you look at the kind of deals that countries are getting currently under status quo without China. China, through its regional stability, through the kind of cooperation that it can entail and propose an alternative to the kind of like norms and like things that you see with like Western institutions, doesn't necessarily have to be here. And for all those reasons, we're very proud to propose.
Hello?
So the previous speaker is right in recognizing that there are certain motivations which govern all the international institutions that exist, right? But what's missing behind the comparative is that the way they make their argument sound is that China simply wants to exist as an alternative to help out smaller countries which are losing out on the because of the bad trade deals that they're getting from IMF or the WTO, right? There's no recognition of the kind of motivations that exist behind these Chinese institutions, and no comparative on why these motivations might be better than the motivations behind Western institutions that exist. Therefore, the first argument that we made in terms of which institutions are easier to correct through an external system is missed out by opening government, and therefore stands at the end of DPM speech. Right? What we told you is that institutions like the IMF, which may be dominated by the United States, are much easier to coerce from external sources, because the United States still conforms by their own ideals to some form of spreading democracy or some form of Western liberal ideals to these countries, and therefore also have to conform to those things and can be called out on those bases. So, for example, when United States removes their funding from Philippines because they don't want to continue funding their drug war, that's something that can specifically happen only at the point at which you have an institution which is willing to listen to external sources information and willing to change the decisions they make based on certain form of ideals. We tell you that the Chinese motivation is purely based on a furtherance of the Communist Party, and therefore isn't something that recognizes what the other countries necessarily get out of it. And as long as they can get the interest of the Communist Party satisfied through the kinds of impositions they have on these deals that they have with these other countries, they don't really care about what implications that has further on from that point on, right? They tell you that Chinese alternatives are better for these countries because they offer better trade deals or rules of trade, where they can ignore certain patents, etc., which something isn't offered by international organizations. We tell you it's important for us to have a singular organization within these constructs, because it's important for everyone to conform to a singular system of trade rules, because that's what inspires confidence in everybody's conforming to a set of rules which everybody will continue to abide by, and therefore not change the kinds of rules that they would follow between different bilateral or multilateral trade deals. And that's the importance of the WTO, right? Having everyone conform to a global order which everyone can therefore be confident in that everyone else will follow as well. And therefore we don't think that simply having alternatives is a good thing in all situations. That idea of free market principles doesn't work everywhere, right? Next, they tell you that China is better when China is also better when the other countries have to pay back. We tell you that China is going to be better because the other countries have to pay them back, and therefore it's in Chinese interest as well. We tell you that Chinese interest in terms of what they gain is also in terms of soft power. So it's not always an economic return which they're looking for, right? So for example, when they want to impose power in Asia through the China-Pakistan economic corridor, they want to influence the government in Pakistan and the politics of Pakistan for the next few decades, which means that as long as they are able to provide loans to Pakistan at a rate at which all Pakistani decisions in the future will be based on what China wants, otherwise they lose funding from Chinese investors, is at the point at which China can continue to impose the direction it wants Asia to take, and therefore create an Asian hegemon or a domination within Asia, which is hard to fight back from Western powers. And therefore we think that at the point at which China is the only actor which can impose certain conditions or impose influence within this region, it's something that is very hard to break away from, and therefore is a bad thing in itself, right? We tell you that the kinds of impositions that the IMF has as an alternative or on the comparative are things like trade liberalization, right? This is how they try to impose democratic principles in other places, and it's not upon sovereign principles of these particular countries, and therefore isn't as bad as the conditions which China is likely to impose in these particular instances. Before I move on to certain constructives.
If China is touting the AIDB as an alternative to the IMF, doesn't it have an incentive to provide a better alternative for it to be successful?
We think to compare the kind of deals that IMF and AIDB are likely to offer, you have to look at where they have greater pull behind them, right? The reason why China can offer better deals, in terms of offering more money for fewer lesser interest rate through the AIDB, is because China is seen as a body which can attract investors from within China and outside, because they see that at the point at which China is able to gain power over these Asian countries and establish a hegemon over these Asian countries is the point at which these investors are also most benefited, right? That's the point. that's the reason why there's greater investment behind the AIDB and not the IMF, and therefore why the IMF isn't able to compete with the AIDB as they claim, right? Therefore, we don't think that it's simply that AIDB will be able to offer like rosier incentives to these countries. It's more along the terms of like where investors think they'll have greater profits, because investors don't particularly care about like the kinds of implications, political implications this is going to have, right? But we tell you that it's also harder to like correct Chinese institutions because there is no other global power which can exert like a massive control over what China does. Even if you believe that the USA is going to stand in opposition to China, this is likely not to happen because of the own admission of the opening government, where they say that the US is in massive debt to China as well, right? So in terms of exerting some form of economic pressure, external pressure through another hegemon is also harder to do with China, at the point at which Chinese money is like what controls all of these other places as well. But in terms of economic imperialism, right? This is an argument that goes completely unchallenged on opening government. But before I move on to it, yes.
Okay, if China is also looking for soft power through the way in which it can contract with these people, then isn't it just more like optimal for a country to say, I'll side with you on UN resolutions if you give me a better deal, than going to the IMF and being screwed over for getting financial and fiscal obligations?
I don't see how that's a better deal for these countries, right? These countries are the ones like which are dictating the negotiation, like, oh, you give me money, I'll like give you my vote if you give me money. It's usually the other way around, where like China is offering them certain incentives in terms of the deal which they're offered for the development aid in return for like giving them their vote at the UN. Which brings me to this idea of economic imperialism, right? How does China actually like try to enforce their kind of dominance across the world, right? So Philippines, at the point at which it got that insane deal, according to government bench from China, was also forced to give up its claim over South China Sea in an arbitration that it won internationally. What this means is that at the point at which like these countries are forced to give up on claims such as these, which are supported by China, China is able to establish control over all of these particular countries, and they have no ability to move out of Chinese dominance post this point. So if their claim is that, look, at any point, if these countries feel like they're being wrong, they can collectivize and move away from it. We don't think it's as simple, because they're simply like indebted to China in terms of the development aid that they've gotten and the loans that they have to pay back, and also like they aren't able to prioritize things like establishing a claim in the South China Sea at the point at which they're looking for like funding for development projects, right? To tell you, China has no problem supporting like the drug war in Philippines, but the USA does, and for like having some form of check and balance in international institutions, we'd rather side with the West than China. For those reasons, we oppose.
Right. Is that? Not using the mic. Make no mistake, the world we live in is one where China already extends secret bilateral deals. It already constructs telecom towers in Angola for kickbacks. It already negotiates with Prague. It already does things like cheap loans and dumping in places like Vietnam and Cambodia. We suggest to you that the rise militarily and economically of China is inevitable. Now we have a choice. Do we want China's right to be mediated by a multilateral institution, or do we want it to be a function of either gunboat diplomacy or secret bilateral deals? Very quickly, I'm going to talk to you about why China's rise is inevitable one way or the other, and then I'm going to look specifically at why, in the context of not just the WTO, right? Because the AIDB rose in response to the Asian Development Bank and other financial institutions in Asia, and the TPP, which has been designed by the AIDB, still exists. I'm going to show you how the mutual dick-swinging contest that exists between Japan and China will inevitably be towards the benefit of the poorest of countries in Asia, something that they will never get. Because if China is seen as a currency manipulator and so terrible, but it has to compete with the IMF, it probably has to be better than the IMF, right? It probably has to do not all the bad things that opening opposition wants to tell us China has to do. But more on that, right? Just felt I had to say that right away. Okay. Why is China's rise inevitable militarily or otherwise? Firstly, because of this general feeling that China has missed out on the third industrial revolution, that they haven't been part of the 18th century development of railways and the British Empire, nor have they capitalized at the point of time where when the Soviet Union was in power. What that means is that there's a resounding feeling within the Communist Party that suggests that it is right, the time is right now that we have an incredibly powerful economy and a concurrently powerful military to be able to develop. I would suggest that the second thing is that given the rise in economic power and the sheer reduction in poverty rates and things like that general influence over things like investments all around the world, there has been a concurrent rise in military. And with the rise in military, they can do things like pursue territorial traditional claims over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands and whatnot, right? However, we would also suggest that the problem right now is that the West cannot necessarily check this militarily. Like, in general, there's a body bag impact in the West, they're facing a recession, they're cutting down on military, and all those sort of things, right? What does this tell you? This tells you that China wants some sort of socio-political influence, but it can obtain that socio-political influence either militarily or by entering into secret bilateral deals with other countries. Why would we rather prefer a world in which China enters a multilateral deal? I think both sides from opening have been incredibly glib in the way the AIDB actually functions. Look, I understand China inserts most of the capital into the AIDB, which means it has maximum voting power, but that doesn't change the fact that each country contributes and also has a seat in the fora, right? It is like, it's commonsensical to suggest that it's a multilateral organization where all countries have some sort of part in the negotiation process. Why do we think this is necessarily a good thing? 5 reasons. 1, we would suggest to you that the context in which the AIDB arose was when China wanted social political influence, but also China was deeply distrusted, right? China is seen as carrying out naval exercises on the South China Pacific and undermining territorial sovereignty. China is seen in all the bad ways that they want to say, because apparently only they in a debating room know that, and countries all around the world around China don't know that, right? What this means is that for China to perhaps change its image and serve as an effective alternative, not just to the WTO, which is terrible, but the Asian Development Bank by Japan that also provides infrastructure loan at reasonably better rates, China probably has to be better, right? China probably has to provide infrastructure loans without like massive interest rates. But I think the second big benefit of that is that if they're going to argue that the WTO is terrible or like the WTO is not probably good, we're going to suggest to you that, so not the WTO, the IMF, the WTO is not part of this debate. China is part of the WTO anyway, right? Okay. If the IMF is terrible, the biggest incentive for the IMF to change is if you have a parallel institution, right? Presumably both the IMF and AIDB and like the ADB want influence in Asia, want to be able to influence policies. We think the fact that you have more alternative creates competition, and this competition works towards the benefits of countries like Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, because it means better trade rates, lower infrastructure, like lower controls on the economy and lower clamping down on sovereignty. I am also going to suggest to you that the comparative is when China is anyway going to want that influence. Now, if it does not do that militarily, it's going to be through a bilateral deal. What's the problem with the bilateral deal? At the very least, a multilateral deal offers the possibility of transparency. Now, why is transparency important? Because while China violates labor law standards or environmental law standards or does things like building dams, as Nigam appears to suggest, China functions on the level of plausible deniability. And the reason why it's able to function on the level of plausible deniability by disassociating responsibility from that, weird shell company that apparently is not Chinese owned, but is actually Chinese owned, is in a bilateral deal where these sort of details don't necessarily come out. I think at the very least what we can promise you as a result of a multilateral deal is that China loses its excuse to be able to function with plausible deniability. Second, I would suggest that the second reason why countries within this multilateral organization do have an incentive to be able to oppose and to collectivize is to simply say that while it is true that there are traditional elements in China that believe in expansionist vision of China, we think that there are people like Xi Jinping who has hinged his extension of his term on promising that ideal that they want to speak of. So to provide context, Xi Jinping needs to justify the millions of dollars he's invested in terms of creating the ADB and giving out infrastructure loans. And the reason why he's done it is to project power, is to show that the AIDB is an effective counterweight to the IMF or the ADB or NAFTA for that matter. We think at the point where countries are threatening to pull out for legitimate causes, all of which will be recorded, we would suggest that undermines his legacy, that undermines all the reasons he has chosen to hinge his political legacy and undermines his capacity to deal with traditional elites in his country. What that suggests to me is that these countries somewhat have power to be able to negotiate within these platforms. I would suggest the third thing is that in general, if you're part of an international organization, you can collectivize. I will differentiate myself from opening government here. You can't collectivize if you are individual countries with different ideas of what's good for you, and if you can't come together because you believe that that country may not be acting in your best interest, or that country may in fact be supporting China. So Cambodia will not be able to interact with Vietnam because it does not know what Vietnam is thinking, right? Providing a public platform solves that game theory sort of like situation. It provides a common agenda and a common statement of intentions. That's what makes collectivization easier. That's what makes questioning the bulwark of China easier. And sure, individual countries may not have the same voting rights as China, but if countries come together, as they do in the World Bank often, they often get to replace the 10 countries that have like 50% of the voting rights on many issues, or have a veto in a lot of issues. We would suggest what this means is that the AIDB functions as an institution that is in fact an effective substitute to all the problems that we both think face the international development market as such today. Look, we have been the only site till now that has contextualized this debate, that has shown you that the rise of China is inevitable. We moderate that rise and we use it for constructive purposes.
Okay. We agree with them when they say that China's rise as a political and military superpower is inevitable. That's true. The question then is, what's the trade-off in terms of the way China reacts with the world? Is it Chinese pet institution versus Chinese secret deal? Or can we show you, and that's what we're going to do at CO, that it's actually Chinese pet institution versus the existing institutions where everybody already works, which is that China will necessarily have to have some kind of a presence at the international level. It cannot conduct all its trade, all its diplomacy, and all its reactions in secret. And if that is really the trade-off, then this debate isn't about Chinese secret deal, which is objectively bad, which I cannot prove to you is better or worse than anything. It's Chinese pet institution versus forcing them to stay in the United Nations, forcing them to stay within other such institutions, and ensuring that these institutions account for the larger influence that China has garnered, right? Well, let's first deal pointedly with Chan before we get to the extension on diplomacy and why diplomacy is the only way to deal with this raging superpower, right? Chan's ridiculous idea is that somehow China's pet institutions will have fair deals where everybody is a member, so we can all vote to ensure that China doesn't do what it wants. Except he, by his own admission, says that the countries who will be in that institution are all countries that are heavily influenced by China, that are infiltrated by Chinese capital, and therefore literally says that at the end of the day, this amounts to what? China writing its own exam and having its own examiner, right? Because the one checking China is the person who already is so dependent on Chinese capital, but there's nothing they can do other than listen to what China says. It's fairly farcical for him to suggest that that is an adequate check, but any form of a check other than a complete garb to create some international legitimacy for ridiculous things they do in the way of creating this institution, right? But then he makes a crucial concession because he says this institution will be good because China cares about its perception. If China really cares about its perception and really cares about the way people think, because at the end of the day, its goal is economic imperialism, which is all their case was at opening. And if they really care about their perception, they'd be fair to see why they'd be willing to conduct all their transactions and their things they do in secret, right? Because that gives them the shady image they don't want. Obviously, they need an institution. Obviously, they need something to give them that legitimacy. Obviously, they need to be transparent. They need to appear like a country that matters, that cares, right? Which means that the comparative in Chan's speech is false
The only comparative in this debate is between China having its own institutions and China opting into existing institutions, and those institutions are counting for Chinese influence. And we then need to look at where we can engage with this like superpower better, right? Because make no mistake, we're different from the opening half because we're not going to place a value judgment on which person is necessarily better, right? We're not going to say the IMF is more benevolent or the World Bank is more benevolent. All we're going to say is that this is a belligerent power that has no internal check, and the only way you can check them externally, the only way you can check their international actions is by having this common forum, right? So let's get to this at the end of the day. Perception matters, transparency is required, international institution is an obligation, which institution, how and why. Diplomacy. Why is diplomacy the trick and the way to deal with a belligerent China, right? Two primary reasons. First, because China is massive in terms of capital, in terms of the resources they have at their disposal, something that's been established in the opening half. We acknowledge that China is massive. They can conduct any kind of alternative standoff in terms of a trade war, in terms of a military standoff. They'll survive it for years and nothing's really going to happen to them. They have a lot of capital. But in addition to that, we think China doesn't have an internal accountability mechanism. Xi Jinping literally just became president for life. He has no reason to do anything other than getting up in the morning and doing exactly what he feels like. He woke up on the left side of the bed and he wants to mess with Vietnam. He woke up on the right side of the bed and he wants to mess with somebody else. He literally can because there's no internal check mechanism on what he does, right? Which means at the end, what we need a place where we can create the small changes that allow us to engage with China and get them to do something, right? China started off in complete stark opposition to any kind of measure that would affect North Korea for its nuclear regime. But over time, because we had the stable institution of the United Nations Security Council, because we had both China, United States, Russia, etc., acknowledging that that is a legitimate institution for us to have all these discussions on international relations, technocrats were able to understand what the interests behind that stance that China took were, right? Why is it that China is doing this? How can we ensure that China supports sanctions for North Korea without them, without really harming the interests that they've taken in that position? And we think when they had that stable forum, they were able to do what they had to do. They were able to eventually convince China that the right thing to do is to support sanctions for North Korea because that's the only way out, right? We think having that institution is important because in their world, you have an alternative institution where China goes. And why are these institutions important? Because as I've told you earlier, they're a source of legitimacy in international relations or in international law, right? It's a source of legitimacy. You need to get everyone else to say what you're doing is good. And we think those institutions have to be only one, and that one place where people like the US and people like the UK can place some influence on China and engage with them on stances that they're taking, right? Because in their world, all that happens is China goes to their alternative institution. In that institution, convinces them that taking a particular military or a particular economic policy is the right thing to do, gets their assent because they literally own those governments, and then move ahead with it without the US ever having the place to engage with them. Closing, if you have a POI.
If we're assuming that diplomacy is a function of how much I'm going to listen to you, that is probably more likely when I'm a trading partner with several countries within a multilateral institution, as opposed to being a big hegemon that can negotiate bilaterally.
If I like put $1 billion into your economy and then you say, hey, I don't think you should do that, you say, hey, shut up, I'll just like pull all the $1 billion out and your poor people will remain poor. Obviously, you're not going to listen to that. That's fairly ridiculous. You need equals to be part of this institution. You need somebody who can stand up to China. There are very few countries in the world that can afford to stand up to China, and they all need to be in that same institution. I don't know how they're still running this case. They're obviously going to lose with it, right? But then, why is it important for you to have this one institution? Why is this one institution good, right? We think on OG, they talk about small countries and how small countries are harmed, but we think the ability to collectivize as one institution makes these small countries better, right? We look at how the LDCs were able to convince the WTO to create that exception for tariff rates in the WTO. They were able to do it because they could collectivize an institution that wasn't governed by one hegemon, right? But in this Chinese institution, how much ever you collectivize, as long as China thinks that the LDC exception is harming its interests, it will not include that exception. So they also cannot prove that this is a better deal, because once I put $500 million of capital into you, you're locked in. You don't have a choice. You cannot leave. It's impossible for you to say, okay, now I'll go to the US and get $500 new, because that's impossible. The money is already locked in. People are dependent in my economy on Chinese money. In the absence of that choice, and in the absence of the ability for these people to have anyone else who's an equal to check the way China engages in these deals, we think this is literally what happens. China goes out of control. We don't have the one place where we can deal with them. The conflict shifts. The conflict becomes a trade deal, a trade war. The conflict becomes a military standoff. And we think the one thing you need, the stable, mutually acceptable forum to convince them, the way we convince them to support sanctions against North Korea, that their stance is wrong, goes away. Don't let them lie about the trade-off. don't let them lie about what the better institution is. We're so proud to oppose.
Yeah.
Attreya was so in love with his case that he didn't listen to what Chan was saying in terms of the other institutions that exist and in terms of there being a competition in the market of institutions that would exist. We told you that the Asian development, the AIDB came up in competition to the Asian Development Bank of Japan. We told you that it's not like the IMF is going to vanish suddenly if this Chinese institution is going to come about, which means that for them to argue that you're going to be, oh my God, so dependent on these countries that you have no alternative whatsoever, that this institution is going to be completely controlling these economies is something which is ridiculous, right? Because we think that firstly, alternatives exist in terms of excessive Chinese behavior. We think that China is not somebody who is going to simply arm twist all countries into oblivion. We think that if it realizes that there are other institutions which exist and these other institutions can always provide these kinds of alternatives as well. But secondly, therefore, we think that China also gets something out of these things, which means out of this institution and out of the continuous economic predictability of these countries. Therefore, it's not going to simply ruin these countries into having absolutely no economic position, that it will not be able to have the kind of economic relations and economic trade that is beneficial. But we also think that if you are developing as a result of the kind of finance you get out of these loans, we think that you are also more likely to pay it back. Therefore, we think that this kind of extreme dependence and that kind of picture that they paint to us is not something which is really realistic. Then they say that the alternative picture that we tell you in terms of how China is going to behave is somehow false. Let's understand how China works it. We think that China works in a way where it chooses to either project a positive image or in the alternative says that we are going to carry out shady deals and gunboat diplomacy and arm twisting, all of these things, right? Because we think that when it does not have an option but to carry out things in a way where their perception is protected, we think that it will continue to resort to the kinds of problematic things that it does. Therefore, we think that in the event that such an alternative already exists, given how large Chinese military is, given how much influence China continues to exert in Southeast Asia or in Africa or now even in Eastern Europe, we think that what that means therefore is that you need an institution to check that kind of belligerence in power. We think that it's not simply enough for them to say that's not the comparative and run away from the debate. We think that it's about arguing about where you can possibly mediate that kind of exertion of power. Then they say that diplomacy is something which is going to work, and the US and UK can exert pressure apparently. Let's understand this. The US pulled out of the TPP. Okay, and after that, the image that the United States had in the world in terms of being an economically predictable power was something which diminished like hell. We think that similarly, the way in which the European Union is working with Brexit happening and with Eastern European countries being unpredictable, we think that the West in general is not being seen as an economically strong entity. And not just that, we think that because of the fact that the West's power is diminishing in these institutions, we don't think that they can simply argue that the kind of pressure that is being exerted by the West is something which is going to be great and miraculously come to control China. Sit down. for context, we think you need to understand the fact that Chinese investment and Chinese control of Chinese deals in terms of the Belt and Road Initiative, in terms of its deals in Eastern Europe, in terms of its heavy entrenchment in Africa, is something which is inevitable, which means that it is going to continue to do all of these things in these countries. And we think that countries, as they have said, are probably going to also see this, as we've said, are probably going to see this as a lucrative measure. We think that, and therefore we think that for you to control China is something which is extremely difficult. Closing.
This debate isn't about what China will do in the countries in which it's invested. Tell me how in your world you will convince China to support sanctions against North Korea the way we did in ours.
By saying that, so let's understand this. This North Korea red herring that they've thrown at you is really ridiculous, because North Korea is something which has direct refugee ramifications on China, in terms of the fact that if something destabilizes in China, there'll be millions of refugees in something destabilizes in North Korea, there'll be millions of refugees in China, right? So it's a very small example that they've used to kind of paint the fact that China is a great diplomatic power. We therefore think that that's something which is an example which you have to look at in isolation in terms of the geopolitical impacts that it has on China, and not in terms of the economic ramifications of North Korea and stuff like that. Yeah.
Let's take you at your best and say that AIDB provides a better deal to these countries. Now they can't just move out without paying back these loans, and China has.
Firstly, let's understand that the amount of control that China would seek to exert in all of these countries would be directly reflective in this institution, in that it would be transparent in nature, which means that China can't simply be a big daddy of everything in an international forum where you have the power of public scrutiny and stuff like that, right? Therefore, we think that they can't simply jump. Like, if you look at your notes, ladies and gentlemen, they've jumped from the argumentation of loans to complete control without really explaining to you how exactly that complete control is going to happen in the instance that firstly there exist alternatives where China is not the only person who you are entirely dependent on, but secondly also the fact that this probably also leads to greater prosperity in these countries, and therefore the extent of dependability on these countries or on China is probably something which is not as extreme and grave as they paint you out to be. Why are we better than OG? Quickly. Firstly, we think that the context of China's rise was something which was important, and the role of the institution in the context of China's rise was something which was important. I think there was a lot of back and forth in the opening half about how exactly China's incentives play out, or how exactly IMF incentives play out. We think that that's something which is not really entirely the debate in terms of what the role of this institution that is created by China is going to be, and we think that that kind of characterization and explanation came to you uniquely from closing government. Therefore, we think at the end of this debate, when you have to judge which team wins this debate, ask yourself what exactly China is going to do, what exactly exists outside of this atmosphere in terms of countries who can influence it, and whether or not that's something which will work out for the world or not. Vote CG.
This should be audible, right? Works for you guys, yeah. I don't. Right, three things in the speech. One, why we're the more important team on offense. Secondly, why we're closing government specifically. And lastly, why opening government fall out of this debate, right? First, offbench. We think opening opposition's case on economic imperialism stands by itself, but we don't think they really answer the China question too, right? Which is why where Osho asked them a POI about how they deal with the China question, they just have some vague response in terms of how we need a singular organization. We think we fulfill answering the China question better than them. Why? Because we think that the China question can be resolved through diplomacy and strategic compromises, and that was the extension you saw from CEO in terms of the process of diplomacy and why you need one place where you can have that kind of diplomacy with China, and why alternatives prevent the ability and the incentives that exist for strategic compromises to be met. Right? What is this process of diplomacy? We told you two things. We told you one, that diplomacy often involves small steps, right? In that it's not like you asking China to completely abandon some policy of theirs, but you asking them to tone down certain provisions that you feel may be harmful. You asking them to negotiate this through certain treaties or through certain identified actions that you can ask them to like tone down on, or you can ask them to scale back on, right? But which means the strategic compromises is the way in which you get high and mighty powers to actually affect change without worrying too much about their perception, right? Because otherwise, if you tell China to withdraw from the Philippines and not influence Duterte's drug war anymore, we think China is going to see that as a loss for its public image. We think you can achieve those goals much better through a series of small steps and strategic compromises where you limit the funding that they're giving to the Philippines, where you limit the ability, China, where you improve oversight over what police in the Philippines are doing, and other small steps, right? But secondly, we think diplomacy is often built upon pre-existing institutional arrangement, right? The compromises are often navigated and built on top of like treaties that exist. It means these diplomatic negotiations are not these suo moto conversations where Xi Jinping once meets like Barack Obama and says, how do we deal with this problem? Let's figure something out, right? What happens is that they look at the pre-existing institutional arrangements they have, the multiple treaties that they have, the multiple agreements that they signed, and which clauses and which provisions of those can be used as bargaining chips in this process of achieving a strategic compromise, right? You say we're members of this treaty and we're going to vote for you in this particular vote that's going to be held under this treaty as long as you do this other thing for us, right? We think that's how you moderate and that's how you mediate China's influence through achieving this kind of strategic compromises. This process can only happen when there's one avenue for diplomacy, which has been the crux of our extension, that alternatives prevent effective diplomacy with China. Two reasons why. One, that your bargaining power with China is very little, right? Because they now don't need to channel all their international relations through your organization. Now they have an alternate organization through which they can get their loan deals signed. They have an alternate organization through which they can get channels for credit. They have an alternate organization through which they can push certain policies that they want to. We think when we do not support these alternate institutional arrangements and we want China to be a part of the same institutional arrangement that exists for the world order as it is, we think that's where you have bargaining power with China, because they don't have alternate spaces to conduct their international relations. But secondly, we think China can legitimize its actions in these alternative institutions, which, as we've argued, are likely to be like populated by people who are likely to agree with China, right? What that means is that China now no longer needs to convince the rest of the world that what it's doing is good, or that sending money to the Philippines for their drug war is a good thing. All they need to do is go back to their pet organization, these people who they're already giving money to, who are already ideologically aligned with them, and get them to legitimize their actions, right? We think people's involvement in international relations by and large very often is a quest for legitimacy for their actions in the international space, and we think providing them with this alternative easy like get out of jail free card is one that simply reduces like your ability to bring China to the negotiating table. We think diplomacy at the UN is the way to deal with China, and alternatives prevent your ability to do so. We're better on off bench. But why be better than CG, right? Because CG tells you two things. They begin their case by telling you that we need to mediate China's rise through international institutions, right? We think the question at that point is which international institutions should be mediating this rise, right? We think it should be existing arrangements instead of China's own alternative. Three reasons why China's own alternative will be ineffective in mediating China's rise. Number one, that they're likely to legitimize China given the economic links and the cultural links that already exist with respect to China, right? What that means is that countries like the Philippines, countries around this region are countries that are ideologically aligned with China in status quo, are countries that are likely to vote China. But second, we think that the opposition they receive is likely to be less for two reasons. One, that the foundational principles of this new international world order are China's foundational principles, that the rules of this international world order are rules that China sets up, that the countries it invites to be a part of this order are countries that China is okay with, right? What that means is that these are countries which are likely to be ideologically aligned with China. But secondly, that small countries have lesser bargaining power within this institution to act as a check on China, right? Understand that when least developed countries at the WTO got an exemption passed for them, it was Latin American countries and South Asian countries all voting together in the same bloc where they were able to achieve that kind of bargaining power. Countries in this region geographically limited region, smaller countries susceptible to Chinese influence simply cannot stand up to China within this region. But if China really cares about perception, which is their characterization, we think that they also will necessarily have to be a part of the international world order where European countries and American countries can check what China does. What is the only response we receive to this? Osho saying that the West is economically weak. Look, be comparative, right? The EU and the USA are weak. They're still stronger than the Philippines in standing up to China, right? They're still stronger than random Southeast Asian countries who are like taking $100 billion loans from China to build critical infrastructure and standing up to China. On the comparative, they check you better. But then he says, oh no, China has incentives to set up good institutions because there's going to be a competition in the marketplace of institutions, right? You can't just opt in and opt out of trade deals like you go to Starbucks and you don't like the coffee and you go to CCD and now you like the coffee, right? These international arrangements often like involve huge amounts of ratification, involve setting up a state policy. Yeah, I'll take closing.
So your literal only example of an institution that can force China to talks is where the only enforceable organization has China with a permanent seat and a veto power.
Well, we're not saying that you're gonna like not give China any voice whatsoever. All we're saying is that where China has veto power, there are 4 other people who have that veto power and who are capable of exercising that veto power at the General Assembly. There are a lot of votes that China needs to get. We're not saying we want to like bring China into an international organization and then stop them from doing anything they want to. We both agree that China's rise is going to happen. The question is, are you better able to mediate it where there are stronger people or where there's literally no one else? But this free marketplace of institutions, right? One, you're surrounded by Chinese military bases because you're geographically located that way, so we don't see how you can just get up and say, oh no, China mistreated me, I'm gonna leave. That like there's already existing Chinese influences, and this lock-in period involves setting up critical infrastructure projects. It involves passing policies, it involves ratifying these deals, it involves a whole lot of institutional arrangements that you can't just or willy-nilly sign out of, right? What that means is that China won't ruin these countries. We agree, they will not ruin these countries, but they'll do really bad things with these countries that you cannot stop them from doing anymore, which means they'll support a drug war that kills innocent people without trial, and you can't stop them from doing so, which means they'll like have economic policies that deprive other people, and you can't stop them from doing so. They just argued something about small countries. We think we already dealt with them in terms of bargaining power. We have proven most things about Chinese diplomacy and why that's likely to work. We're super proud to approve.